Good evening. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope the day has begun to loosen its hold on you. For most of human history, hearing the voice of someone far away was impossible. A letter could cross an ocean, a telegraph could carry a coded message. But a voice, the familiar sound of another person speaking, disappeared almost as soon as it was heard. Then, in the 19th century, a young man became fascinated by the possibility of changing that. His name was Alexander Graham Bell Boston, March 10th, 1876, late afternoon. A small room on the top floor of a boarding house at 5 Exeter Place smelled of acid and hot metal. Wires ran across a cluttered workbench. A young man knelt beside a strange wooden device, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his fingers stained from chemicals. In the next room, another man leaned close to a small cup-shaped receiver, waiting, as he had waited so many times before, for a sound that might finally arrive whole and clear. The young man was Alexander Graham Bell. He was 29 years old. He'd spent years chasing a single, almost impossible idea, that the human voice, with all its softness and shading, could be carried not by wire alone, as the telegraph already did, but as a living electrical echo of speech itself. That night, working with acid and copper and a thin, vibrating diaphragm, something happened that had never quite happened before. Bell spilled a small amount of acid on his clothing. Startled, in pain, he called out to his assistant in the next room, a young man named Thomas Watson. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." It was an ordinary sentence said in a moment of minor distress. But in the next room, through the wire, through the strange little device, Thomas Watson heard it. Not as a buzz, not as a code of clicks, but as words, human words, a human voice, carried on electricity from one room to another. Consider the strangeness of what had just occurred. For all of human history, up until that very afternoon, a voice could travel only as far as it could be shouted, or as far as an instrument could carry it, or as far as ink and paper could be sent by hand or by horse or by rail. And now, in a modest rented room in Boston, a voice had travelled through a wire instantly intact, recognizable. But to understand how this happened, how a young teacher of the deaf came to alter forever the way human beings speak to one another across distance, we must go back past that acid-stained afternoon, back past the years of failed experiments and borrowed workshops, back across an ocean to a grey city in Scotland, where a boy was born into a family already obsessed, in its own particular way, with the mystery of the human voice. If you find comfort in stories of patient, quiet persistence, stories of ordinary evenings spent testing an idea that the world had not yet asked for, settle in. This is a good story for that. And if you find this kind of history calming, you may wish to follow along for more evenings like this one. There is no need to do anything now but listen. Let us begin, as these stories should, with the world he was born into. To understand Alexander Graham Bell, you must first understand the peculiar profession of his father, his grandfather, and eventually his brothers. The Bells were, in a sense, professional experts in the human voice, how it was made, how it could be improved, how it could be understood even when the ear that should have heard it could not. Edinburgh in the 1840s was a city that took ideas seriously. It had long been called the Athens of the North, a place of medical schools, printing houses, philosophical societies, and a university with a reputation stretching across Europe. The streets were divided sharply between the old town, a maze of tall stone tenements stacked along the ridge beneath the castle, and the new town with its wide Georgian avenues and orderly squares, built in the previous century as a calmer, more rational counterpart to the crowded medieval streets above. It was a city of contrasts, ancient and modern, cramped and spacious, poor and prosperous, often within the space of a single street. The Bell family lived in this atmosphere of intellectual seriousness. Alexander Melville Bell, the boy's father, was a man devoted to what he called visible speech, a system of symbols meant to represent, with scientific precision, the exact position of the tongue, lips, and throat needed to produce any sound in any human language. It was an unusual, almost eccentric ambition, to reduce the fluid, living act of speaking into a diagram that anyone, even someone who had never heard a spoken word, could read and reproduce aloud. Melville Bell was already, by the time of his son's birth, a respected teacher of elocution, called upon to correct stammers, soften harsh accents, and train actors and clergymen in the proper production of speech. Melville had inherited this fascination in part from his own father, Alexander Bell, a man who had begun his working life as a shoemaker in St Andrews before reinventing himself, through study and determination, as a teacher of elocution and a writer on the science of speech. The senior Alexander Bell had performed public readings and lectures on correct pronunciation, and had written manuals used across Britain to teach proper speaking. There was then already a family tradition, 2 generations deep, of treating the voice not as something mysterious or unteachable, but as a mechanism that could be studied, mapped, and improved. Melville married Eliza Grace Simons, an accomplished woman considerably older than many brides of her era, a painter and a pianist of real skill. Eliza was, by the time of her marriage, almost completely deaf, though she had not been born so. Her hearing had faded gradually, likely beginning in her 20s, until she could hear very little without assistance. She used an ear tube, a small horn-shaped device, held close to a speaker's mouth, to catch what fragments of sound she could. Despite this, she continued to play the piano with real feeling, judging the music not entirely through her ears, but through the vibrations she felt in the instrument, and through a deep, trained memory of pitch and rhythm from the hearing she had once possessed. It is worth pausing here, gently, on what it must have meant for a small boy to grow up with a mother who could not hear him in the ordinary way, and a father whose entire profession was devoted to making speech visible, precise, and transmissible to those who could not hear it at all. Long before he built a single wire or diaphragm, young Alexander was already living inside the central puzzle of his future life. How does sound reach a person who cannot simply hear it? How do we carry meaning across a gap that seems at first impossible to cross? Into this household, on March 3rd, 1847, in a modest house on South Charlotte Street in Edinburgh, a second son was born. He was named Alexander, after his father and grandfather, though for much of his boyhood he was known simply as Alec, a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life among family and close friends, used affectionately by his parents, his brothers, and later by Mabel herself, even long after the wider world had come to know him by his full and more formal name. He had an older brother, Melville James Bell, born 2 years earlier, and would later have a younger brother, Edward Charles Bell. For the first years of his life he carried no middle name at all. He was simply Alexander Bell, one more Alexander in a family already full of them. The house on South Charlotte Street stood in Edinburgh's new town, among the disciplined rows of stone townhouses that gave the district its reputation for order and respectability. It was not a grand house, but it was comfortable, filled with books, musical instruments, and the constant low hum of ideas about language and sound. From his earliest years, Alec grew up watching his father demonstrate his system of visible speech to visitors, reading aloud from strange rows of symbols, sounds in languages he had never studied, simply by interpreting the diagrams that represented how the mouth should move. It was, to onlookers, something close to a magic trick. To young Alec, it was simply how his family understood the world. Sound was a puzzle with a solution, and his father had found part of that solution. Outside the front door, Edinburgh itself offered an education of its own. The city was alive with the sounds of horse-drawn traffic on cobblestone, the calls of street vendors, the bells of nearby churches, the particular cadence of Scottish speech in all its regional variety, a living laboratory of the very subject that obsessed his family indoors. The contrast between the ordered, quiet interior of the Bell household and the noisy, breathing city outside its windows would, in its own quiet way, shape the boy who grew up between them. Melville Bell's professional reputation, by the time of his son's birth, extended well beyond Edinburgh itself. He had already published several works on elocution and speech correction, and he travelled periodically to lecture in London and other British cities, called upon by institutions eager to correct regional accents, treat stammers, or train public speakers in the clear, resonant delivery expected of clergymen, lawyers, and politicians of the era. This meant that the Bell household, while not wealthy in any grand sense, enjoyed a comfortable, professionally respectable status. The kind of quiet respectability common among Edinburgh's growing class of educated professionals, men and women who earned their standing not through inherited land or industrial fortune, but through expertise, publication, and reputation. Eliza Bell's own family background added another layer of refinement to the household. Before her hearing began to fade, she had trained seriously as a painter, and she maintained, even after her hearing loss, a discerning eye for art and a genuine appreciation for careful, patient craftsmanship, qualities she passed on in different form to her inventive middle son. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a woman of considerable inner strength, refusing to allow her deafness to diminish her participation in family and social life, insisting on attending concerts and lectures despite hearing only fragments of what was said, relying on her sons and husband to relay the substance of conversations she could not fully follow on her own. The wider Bell family, too, contributed to the intellectual atmosphere of the household. Alexander Bell the elder, the boy's grandfather, though based mostly in London by this point in his life, remained a figure of considerable influence, corresponding regularly with his son Melville about matters of speech, elocution, and the family's shared scholarly interests. Visits from this grandfather were, by family accounts, treated as significant occasions, the elder Alexander Bell arriving with stories of London's theatrical and academic circles, further reinforcing for young Alec the sense that his family's particular fascination with the voice was no mere private eccentricity, but a serious, respected, multi-generational vocation. It was in this household, full of speech, full of silence, full of instruments both mechanical and musical, that Alexander Graham Bell took his first steps into a life that would eventually teach millions of people that the two need never be entirely separate again. Childhood, for Alec Bell, was not the childhood of a boy destined obviously for greatness. He was by most accounts an unremarkable student in the formal sense, restless in the classroom, prone to daydreaming, more interested in the natural world outside the schoolroom window than in the rote lessons offered inside it. He attended the Royal High School of Edinburgh, one of the oldest and most respected schools in Scotland, but he left it at the age of 15 without any particular distinction, his formal academic record modest at best. This might seem, at first, an unlikely beginning for a man who would later be honoured with degrees from some of the world's great universities. But it fits a pattern common to many original minds, a restlessness with prescribed learning, paired with an intense, almost obsessive curiosity about whatever subject had genuinely caught their attention. For young Alec, that subject was, from very early on, sound itself, and, closely related to it, the workings of living things. One story from his childhood, often retold by his family and later by Bell himself, captures this restless curiosity well. As a boy, he became fascinated with a neighbouring flour mill and the mechanical processes used there. Together with a friend, young Alec built a simple device, something like a rudimentary machine using rotating paddles and brushes, meant to help remove the husks from wheat more efficiently. The device actually worked, well enough that the mill's owner, impressed by the ingenuity of two boys still in their early teens, allowed them to use it. It was Alec's first invention, small and largely forgotten by history, but revealing of a mind that did not merely wonder about mechanical problems but reached instinctively for solutions. A more haunting anecdote from this period concerns his interest in animal sound and imitation. Alec and his older brother Melly, fascinated by their father's studies, taught the family dog, a Skye Terrier, to growl continuously while they manipulated its throat and jaw with their hands, shaping the growl into rough approximations of words. The dog could be made, with careful manipulation, to produce something that sounded almost like, "How are you, Grandmama?" It was a game, but it was also, in its odd way, an early experiment in the mechanics of speech production, treating the vocal apparatus, even that of an animal, as something that could be understood and reshaped by careful, patient manipulation. This willingness to experiment on living, breathing mechanisms extended in time to something more sophisticated. As a teenager, inspired by his father's demonstrations of how the human vocal tract produced different sounds, Alec and his brother Melly built a mechanical model of the human head and throat, complete with a rubber-lined mouth and a set of bellows to simulate lungs. When operated correctly, the device could produce recognizable, if somewhat eerie, imitations of human speech. A few simple words, spoken not by a person, but by a machine built by two curious boys working from their father's scientific understanding of the vocal tract. It was, in miniature, an early ancestor of the very question that would occupy Bell for the rest of his working life. What, physically, is a voice, and can its behaviour be reproduced, transmitted, or transformed by mechanical or electrical means? Music was another quiet thread running through his boyhood. His mother's near-total deafness had not diminished her devotion to the piano, and she encouraged her sons to develop their own musical ability. Alec showed real talent as a pianist, and for a time even considered whether music might become his profession, rather than teaching or invention. He developed, alongside his musical training, an unusually sensitive and discriminating ear, the kind of ear that could detect the subtlest variation in pitch or tone. This sensitivity to sound, cultivated first through music, would prove essential decades later, when the difference between a working telephone and a failed one might come down to a variation in vibration too small for an ordinary ear to register. There is a particular kind of loneliness, too, that shaped these years, a private sorrow that would return again and again across his life. When Alec was still quite young, his mother's deafness meant that communication within the household required patience and adaptation. Few outside the family would have understood. He and his brothers developed the habit of speaking close to her forehead, so the vibrations of speech would reach her more directly, or using a specially designed ear tube to bring sound nearer to what remained of her hearing. Some family accounts describe Alec as unusually attentive to his mother in this way, patient and gentle in a manner that seemed, even then, older than his years. By his mid-teens, Alec's education took a more formal turn, though even here his path wound rather than ran straight. At 16, seeking both experience and a measure of independence, he took a position as a student teacher of elocution and music at Western House Academy in Elgin, Scotland, in exchange for free tuition and a small salary. It was there that his younger brother Edward, still a boy, would remain behind in Edinburgh, and it was there that Alec first stood in front of students of his own, teaching subjects his father had already made central to family life: correct pronunciation, the mechanics of speech, and the discipline of clear communication. He continued his own studies during this period as well, later attending the University of Edinburgh, and afterwards spending time at University College London, though he never completed a formal university degree in the way his later honorary titles might suggest. His education in the end was a patchwork, part classroom, part family workshop, part independent study. But it was precisely this patchwork nature that allowed him to move fluidly, later in life, between subjects that more conventionally trained minds might have kept separate: acoustics, physiology, electricity, and mechanical invention. It was also during his teenage years that Alec added the middle name by which history would come to know him. As a boy, he had felt keenly the awkwardness of sharing his exact name with his father and grandfather, and around the age of 11, he asked his father for a middle name of his own, the way his brothers had one. For his 11th birthday, Melville Bell gave his son the gift of a middle name, Graham, chosen in honour of Alexander Graham, a family friend and a former student of Melville's whom young Alec greatly admired. From that point on, he was Alexander Graham Bell, a small act of naming chosen not imposed, that in hindsight reads almost like a young boy quietly staking a claim to his own identity, separate from the two Alexanders who had come before him. There was, too, a natural history side to young Alec that deserves its own quiet mention. Edinburgh's countryside was within easy reach even from the new town, and Alec spent long hours collecting plants, examining insects, and building a small private collection of specimens gathered on walks with his brothers. He kept careful, if childishly rendered, notes on what he found, an early sign of the same patient, cataloguing habit of mind that would later serve him well in the slow, methodical work of laboratory experimentation. Family letters from this period describe a boy who could disappear for hours into the fields beyond the city, returning with pockets full of leaves, feathers, and small stones, each one carefully explained to whichever family member would listen. He was also, in these years, developing the habit of quiet, careful observation of the adults around him, a habit that would serve him well later, both as a teacher and as an inventor. Visitors to the Bell household often included other scientists, elocutionists, and occasionally deaf individuals seeking Melville Bell's help, and young Alec absorbed a great deal simply by watching these encounters unfold. He noticed, in a way that seemed unusual for a boy his age, how his father adjusted his teaching approach for each visitor, how patience and small adjustments in method could open a door that seemed, at first, permanently closed. This lesson, that a seemingly impossible communication gap could often be closed through patient, careful adaptation rather than force, would echo through the rest of his working life, first in his approach to teaching deaf children, and later in his approach to inventing. Consider, too, what it meant for a boy to grow up in a household where two different languages of sound existed side by side: the spoken, heard language of his father's lectures and his own boyhood conversations, and the felt, watched, vibration-sensed language his mother relied upon. Alec moved fluidly between these two worlds from a very early age, translating for his mother when needed, reading her lips, occasionally using simple hand signs the family had developed between themselves, though the household as a whole leaned towards speech and lip reading rather than a formal sign language. This fluency between two very different ways of receiving the same information was, in its quiet way, a kind of early training in exactly the problem he would spend his adult life trying to solve. How do you carry meaning across a gap where the ordinary channel does not function as expected? Beneath all of this, the mechanical tinkering, the musical training, the patient attentiveness to his deaf mother, the patchwork education, a quiet thread was being spun, one that would not fully reveal its pattern until many years later. The boy who grew up surrounded by the science of speech, who built machines that could imitate a human voice, who trained his ear on the piano until it could catch the faintest variation in pitch, was, without quite knowing it yet, being prepared for a very particular kind of work. But before that work could begin, tragedy would visit the Bell household, not once but twice, and it would change the direction of Alexander Graham Bell's entire life. The 1860s brought a run of sorrow to the Bell family that is difficult even now to read about without feeling its weight. Both of Alec's brothers, Melville James Bell, his elder by 2 years, and Edward Charles Bell, his younger, died of tuberculosis within a few years of each other, in a period when the disease moved through families with a cruelty that medicine of the time could do little to resist. Edward died first, in 1867, only in his teens. Melly followed in 1870, not long after his marriage, his health failing in the same slow, relentless way tuberculosis so often claimed its victims in that era. A persistent cough, a gradual wasting, periods of false improvement followed by relapse, until at last there was no more improvement to hope for. Alec himself had never been robust in health, and in the aftermath of these two deaths, his parents grew deeply afraid for their one remaining son. He too showed some signs of the fatigue and low constitution that had preceded his brother's decline, and Melville and Eliza Bell became convinced that Scotland's damp, cold climate, the very air that had shaped centuries of Bell family history, might be quietly killing their last remaining child as well. Imagine being the surviving son in such a household. Imagine the particular quiet terror of every cough, every tired afternoon, every small illness, now freighted with the memory of two brothers who had seemed, at first, only a little unwell. It is not hard to understand why Melville Bell, a man not given to rash decisions, made one of the most significant decisions of his life in response. He decided the family would leave Scotland entirely. In 1870, the Bell family emigrated to Canada, settling first at a home called Melville House in Brantford, Ontario. In a rural setting the family hoped would offer cleaner air and a gentler climate than the coal smoke and damp of Edinburgh. Alec, 23 years old, arrived in Canada as the last surviving son of a family that had already buried 2 children, carrying with him both grief and a certain unspoken responsibility. The sense, perhaps never stated aloud but surely felt, that he now had to justify, through the life he built, the sacrifice his parents had made in leaving everything they had known behind. The Canadian countryside around Brantford offered something the crowded streets of Edinburgh never had: quiet, space, and time to think. Alec spent long hours outdoors, and his health did seem to improve in this new setting. He developed a particular fondness for a spot along the Grand River near the family home, a quiet outdoor space where he would later say some of his most important thinking took place. Thinking not only about his health and his future, but about the persistent mechanical and scientific questions that had followed him since boyhood. Years later, this spot would come to be remembered somewhat romantically as the place where the earliest seeds of the telephone were planted, though the truth, as with most such stories, is more gradual and less cinematic than the legend suggests. It was also in this period that Alexander Melville Bell's professional reputation opened a door that would prove decisive for his son's future. Melville was invited to demonstrate his system of visible speech in Boston, a city that, in the 1870s, stood at the center of American efforts to educate deaf children, using new and often controversial methods. Melville, however, was growing older and had other commitments, and so it was young Alec, now in his mid-20s, his health improved, his father's system of visible speech thoroughly mastered from a lifetime of exposure, who was sent instead to take up this work in his father's place. This decision, made almost as a practical family matter, would change the entire direction of history. Alec Bell crossed from rural Ontario into the bustling, ambitious city of Boston, Massachusetts, in April of 1871, to begin teaching visible speech to teachers of the deaf. He could not have known, arriving in that unfamiliar American city with his father's teaching system as his only real credential, that he was walking toward both a profession that would define his early career and eventually toward the invention that would make his name known around the world. The details of those years of loss, when examined closely, reveal just how thoroughly grief reshaped the Bell family's sense of what mattered. Edward's decline had been swift by the standards of the disease, but no less devastating for its speed, and Melville and Eliza had barely finished mourning him when Mellie's health began its own slow deterioration a few years later. Mellie had married in 1867, and his death in 1870 left behind a young widow, adding yet another layer of sorrow to a family already stretched thin by grief. Alexander Melville Bell, a man normally described as measured and controlled in temperament, was by his own later account profoundly shaken by these losses, and it was this shock, more than any single medical recommendation, that drove the decision to leave Scotland entirely, rather than risk losing his last remaining son to the same disease. The journey itself, crossing the Atlantic by steamship, and then travelling inland by rail to reach Ontario, took the family through an unfamiliar landscape of ports, cities, and finally the quieter agricultural countryside around Brantford. For Alec, 23 years old and grieving two brothers while nursing private fears about his own health, the journey offered a strange kind of relief even amid its sadness, a chance to begin again, in a place with no immediate associations to the sick room scenes that had marked the family's final years in Scotland. Melville House, the home the family settled into, sat on a bluff overlooking the Grand River, surrounded by orchards and open fields quite unlike anything the family had known in Edinburgh's dense urban new town. Alec's health did genuinely improve in this new setting, a fact that both relieved and validated his parents' difficult decision to emigrate. He took up long walks and horseback rides through the surrounding countryside, and he later credited this period of rest and outdoor activity with restoring much of the vigour that had worried his family so deeply in the years following his brothers' deaths. He also continued, even in this restorative environment, his habit of restless intellectual activity, corresponding with scientific contacts, reading widely, and turning over, in quiet moments beside the Grand River, the various mechanical and acoustic puzzles that had occupied him since boyhood. It was also during this Canadian interlude that Bell began seriously experimenting, for the first time on his own initiative rather than as part of his father's demonstrations, with the idea of using electricity to transmit sound. He had been aware for some time of ongoing telegraph experiments elsewhere, and the relative quiet of rural Ontario gave him space to think through, without the distractions of Edinburgh's dense professional and family obligations, exactly what kind of device might be capable of carrying something as complex as a musical note, or perhaps even a spoken word, along a wire. These were still only early half-formed ideas at this stage, sketched more in his imagination than on paper, but they represented the first stirrings of the pursuit that would consume the following decade of his life. But before we follow him into that American chapter, it is worth sitting for a moment with what he had already survived. The deaths of both his brothers, the uprooting of his entire family across an ocean, the quiet fear that his own body might be failing him in the same way theirs had. He carried this grief westward with him, the way people often do, transforming it, not consciously, not deliberately, but simply through the ordinary alchemy of a determined life, into a fierce, patient dedication to work that mattered. And the work waiting for him in Boston mattered a great deal, to more people than he yet knew. Boston in the early 1870s was a city that believed deeply in reform, education, and scientific progress. It was home to some of the most important institutions for the education of the deaf in the entire country, and it was into this world that Alexander Graham Bell arrived, still only 24 years old, carrying his father's teaching method and a reputation, however modest, as a capable and sympathetic instructor. Bell began teaching at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes, and soon after at the Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton, and the American Asylum for Deaf Mutes in Hartford. His method, rooted in his father's visible speech, focused on teaching deaf children to speak aloud rather than relying solely on sign language, a controversial approach even then, one that would remain a subject of genuine and sometimes heated debate within the deaf community for generations afterward. Bell believed sincerely and passionately that deaf children who learned to speak and to read lips would be better equipped to participate in a hearing world that showed little inclination to adapt itself to them. It is worth pausing on this point honestly. Bell's advocacy for oral education and his later involvement in efforts to discourage sign language and even discourage marriage between deaf individuals are aspects of his legacy that many in the deaf community, then and now, have viewed with real and justified criticism. His motives, by most historical accounts, were not born of cruelty, but of a specific, era-bound conviction about integration. Yet the effects of that conviction on generations of deaf children and adults were often painful, and this is a part of his story that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than quiet omission. Whatever the complexities of his views, Bell's talent as a teacher was quickly and widely recognized. He proved unusually gifted at helping deaf students achieve clear, understandable speech, applying his father's precise diagrams of tongue and lip position with patience and genuine warmth. Students who worked with him often remembered him fondly, describing a teacher who treated them with respect and expected real progress, rather than simply managing their disability. In 1872, Bell opened his own school in Boston, the School of Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech, training other teachers in his father's methods. The following year, he was appointed Professor of Vocal Physiology and Elocution at Boston University, a position that gave him both a stable income and a serious academic platform. He was not yet 30 years old, and he had already achieved a level of professional respectability that would have satisfied many men for a lifetime. But Bell's mind, as it had been since boyhood, was restless, and it kept wandering back toward a mechanical and electrical puzzle that had nothing directly to do with teaching the deaf, yet felt to him deeply connected to it. If sound could be understood as vibration, and his father's entire life's work rested on the premise that it could, then perhaps vibration itself could be captured, transmitted, and reproduced by mechanical or electrical means. This was not, in the 1870s, an entirely original idea. The telegraph already carried messages across vast distances using electrical pulses, and a number of inventors on both sides of the Atlantic were experimenting with the idea of sending multiple telegraph messages simultaneously over a single wire, a concept known as the harmonic telegraph. Bell, characteristically, saw an opportunity that others working on the same problem did not. If a wire could carry several distinct musical pitches at once, each representing a separate telegraph signal, why could it not, in principle, carry the far more complex and continuously varying vibrations of an actual human voice? Year after year, in the hours before and after his teaching duties, Bell pursued this idea, often exhausted, often broke, always slightly apart from the world of professional inventors and financiers who might have taken him more seriously had he not also been, by trade, a teacher of the deaf, rather than a trained electrical engineer. He lacked, in these early years, the technical training that men like his eventual rivals possessed. What he had instead was an unusually deep, almost intuitive understanding of the physical mechanics of sound, an understanding built not in a laboratory, but in a childhood spent building mechanical talking heads and manipulating a dog's growl into human-sounding words. It was in Boston that Bell also met the two people who would matter most to the rest of his life, in very different ways. The first was Gardner Green Hubbard, a prominent and wealthy Boston lawyer with a deep personal interest in the education of the deaf. His own daughter, Mabel, had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. Hubbard became, in time, both Bell's most important financial backer and his father-in-law. The second was that daughter herself, Mabel Hubbard, who became one of Bell's private students in speech reading and correction. Mabel Hubbard was intelligent, spirited, and despite her deafness, remarkably skilled at reading lips and speaking clearly, thanks to years of careful training predating her time with Bell. When Bell began tutoring her, she was still a teenager, 10 years younger than her teacher, and their relationship began, appropriately, on entirely professional footing. But over the months and years of their lessons together, something deeper grew between them, a mutual respect that slowly became something more tender. Mabel would later say that she fell in love with Bell gradually, almost without noticing the moment it happened, won over by his kindness, his enthusiasm, and the sheer intensity of his intellectual curiosity. Their courtship was not without difficulty. Gardner Hubbard, while fond of Bell personally, harboured real doubts about a struggling teacher and part-time inventor as a match for his daughter, and he was, for a time, more invested in Bell's telegraph experiments as a business proposition than in Bell as a prospective son-in-law. It would take years of patient devotion, both to Mabel and to the invention that Hubbard hoped might finally bring the young teacher some financial security, before the two were permitted to marry. Bell's approach to teaching Mabel and his other private students offers a useful window into his particular gifts as an educator. Rather than treating deafness as a fixed limitation to be managed, Bell approached each student's speech difficulties as a solvable technical problem, applying his father's careful diagrams of tongue and lip position with the same patient, methodical curiosity he would later bring to his laboratory work. He kept detailed notes on each student's progress, adjusting his methods when one approach failed to produce results, trying again with a slightly different technique, much the way he would later test transmitter after transmitter in his acoustic experiments. Several of his students later credited him not merely with improving their speech, but with restoring to them a confidence in their own ability to participate fully in a hearing world that had often treated them as fundamentally apart from it. Boston itself, during these years, offered Bell an unusually rich intellectual environment for pursuing his growing fascination with electricity and telegraphy. The city was home to a lively community of scientific lecturers, amateur inventors, and university faculty willing to discuss new ideas with genuine seriousness, regardless of a visitor's formal credentials. Bell attended public lectures on electricity whenever his schedule allowed, read voraciously on the subject in whatever spare hours he could find, and gradually built, through self-directed study rather than formal coursework, a working understanding of electrical principles sufficient to support his experiments, even if it never matched the rigorous systematic training of a formally educated electrical engineer. This gap in formal training would remain, throughout his early experimental years, a source of both humility and occasional frustration, as Bell found himself needing to lean heavily on collaborators like Thomas Watson to translate his conceptual insights into properly functioning electrical apparatus. It was also during this Boston period that Bell first began keeping the detailed laboratory notebooks that would later prove so important, both scientifically and legally, to establishing the precise timeline of his telephone experiments. These notebooks, filled with sketches, notes on failed attempts, and careful records of each day's small adjustments, reveal a mind that combined genuine flashes of intuitive insight with an underlying discipline of record-keeping that many popular accounts of Bell, focused as they often are on the drama of sudden inspiration, tend to overlook. The telephone, in truth, emerged not from a single flash of genius, but from years of this quieter, more methodical accumulation of small, carefully documented adjustments. In the meantime, Bell divided his exhausted hours between two demanding pursuits: his teaching career, which paid his bills and satisfied his genuine sense of purpose, and his after-hours experiments with electricity and sound, which consumed his evenings and increasingly his hopes for the future. It was a punishing schedule for a young man still not fully recovered, by his family's estimation, from the fragile health of his youth, and it would not get easier before it got harder. By the mid-1870s, Bell found himself caught in a familiar and exhausting pattern common to many inventors before and since. He had an idea he believed in fiercely, a small amount of financial backing that was never quite enough, and a rival working on a similar problem whose progress he could never be entirely sure of. His financial backers, Gardner Hubbard and a leather merchant named Thomas Sanders, whose own deaf son had also come to Bell for tutoring, were primarily interested in the harmonic telegraph, the practical, commercially promising idea of sending multiple messages over a single wire. Bell's growing obsession with the far more ambitious and, to his backers, far less obviously profitable idea of transmitting the actual human voice was viewed by Hubbard and Sanders with a certain patient skepticism. They allowed him to pursue it, but only as a secondary project, always pressing him to return his attention to the harmonic telegraph, which seemed the surer path to financial return. It was in this climate of divided attention and financial strain that Bell hired Thomas A. Watson, a skilled young electrician and mechanic working at a Boston machine shop, to help build and refine his experimental devices. Watson possessed the practical, hands-on technical skill that Bell, for all his theoretical insight, often lacked. Together in a cramped workshop, the two men spent countless evenings testing wires, diaphragms, magnets, and acid-base transmitters, chasing an idea that most of the scientific establishment considered at best a curious impossibility. The daily reality of this work was far from glamorous. Bell and Watson tested device after device, most of which produced nothing more than static, faint clicks or unintelligible noise. Bell would work through the day at his teaching duties, arrive at the workshop exhausted in the evening, and often work late into the night, sometimes falling asleep at his workbench, sometimes waking Watson at strange hours with a fresh idea that demanded immediate testing. Watson later remembered these years with a mixture of exasperation and deep affection, describing Bell as brilliant but scattered, prone to sudden inspirations that pulled him away from more methodical, incremental progress. Lesser spirits might have given up entirely, particularly given how little encouragement came from the wider scientific community. When Bell travelled to consult with the eminent scientist Joseph Henry, then head of the Smithsonian Institution, about his voice transmission ideas, Henry reportedly told him he possessed the germ of a great invention. But when Bell confessed he lacked the electrical knowledge to build it properly himself, Henry's blunt advice was simply, "Get it." It was not discouragement exactly, but it was a stark reminder of how far Bell still had to travel, technically, to make his idea real. Compounding the difficulty was the presence, unseen but keenly felt, of other inventors working on strikingly similar problems. Elisha Gray, a talented and well-funded electrical engineer associated with Western Union, was pursuing his own experiments with transmitting sound over wire, and the two men, without any coordination or even much direct contact, were racing, largely unaware of just how close a race it actually was, toward a similar breakthrough. This unseen competition added a particular quiet anxiety to Bell's already exhausting schedule. He could never be entirely sure how far ahead or behind his unseen rival might be. By 1875, working late one June night, Bell and Watson achieved a genuine, if partial, breakthrough. While testing a harmonic telegraph transmitter, a small metal reed became stuck, and as Watson tried to free it by plucking it with his finger, Bell, listening from another room through the receiving apparatus, heard something unexpected. Not the clean, single-pitch signal they had intended to test, but a complex twanging sound rich with overtones, closer in its texture to a musical or vocal sound than to the simple telegraph clicks they had been chasing. Bell rushed into the room and asked Watson to repeat exactly what he had done. In that accidental moment, Bell understood something crucial. The electrical current running through the wire could, if shaped correctly, carry a continuously varying signal, not just an on-off pulse, but an undulating current capable, in principle, of reproducing the full complexity of a human voice. This insight, sometimes called the twanged reed moment, gave Bell the theoretical foundation he needed, but the practical work of building a device that could reliably transmit and receive intelligible speech remained agonizingly difficult. Through the remainder of 1875 and into early 1876, Bell and Watson continued their exhausting nightly experiments, testing transmitter after transmitter, receiver after receiver, chasing the elusive combination of materials and design that would let a human voice travel, whole and recognizable, through a wire. During this same grinding period, Bell's personal life offered both comfort and additional pressure. His engagement to Mabel Hubbard had finally been secured, though her father continued to link his approval, at least implicitly, to Bell's progress on his inventions and his ability to provide financial security. Bell loved Mabel deeply and sincerely, and letters between them from this period reveal a tenderness quite separate from the frantic mechanical work consuming his evenings. But even this tenderness existed under a certain quiet strain, the strain of a young man trying to prove himself worthy, professionally and financially, of the woman he hoped to marry. It was also during this period that Bell filed his now famous patent application on February 14th, 1876, for an apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. In one of the more remarkable coincidences in the history of invention, Elisha Gray filed a caveat, a preliminary notice of an invention not yet fully completed. for a strikingly similar device at the very same patent office on that very same day, the question of exactly who filed first and what each man actually knew of the other's work at that precise moment would become a subject of legal dispute and historical debate for years afterward, and remains, even now, a matter some historians continue to examine with genuine scholarly care rather than settled certainty. What is not in dispute is that Bell's patent, once granted, would become one of the most valuable and fiercely litigated patents in American history. The days immediately following the patent filing were, in their own way, as tense as anything that had come before. Bell now held a patent for a device he had not yet actually built in fully working form. He and Watson understood, with a certain quiet urgency that neither of them spoke about directly, that a patent alone proved nothing to a skeptical public, to Hubbard's cautious investors, or even, in the most private sense, to Bell himself. A working device still had to be built. The gap between a legal claim on paper and a functioning machine in the physical world was, as any inventor of the era could have told him, often the widest and most dangerous gap of all. For nearly a month after the patent was granted, Bell and Watson returned to their now familiar routine of nightly experimentation, testing transmitter after transmitter, adjusting the tension of diaphragms, altering the composition of the acid solution used in the transmitter, and listening again and again for some improvement in clarity. Watson would later describe these final weeks as some of the most demanding of the entire project, precisely because the two men now believed, with real conviction, that success was close at hand, which made every failed test more frustrating than it might otherwise have felt in the earlier, more exploratory stages of their work. By age 29, still without a truly reliable working telephone, Bell had already spent the better part of 6 years pursuing this single idea, first as an occasional evening hobby alongside his teaching duties, and increasingly, by 1875 and 1876, as something closer to an all-consuming second occupation. There were nights, Watson later recalled, when Bell grew visibly discouraged, wondering aloud whether the entire pursuit might end the way so many ambitious inventions of the era did, as an interesting but ultimately impractical curiosity, remembered by history, if at all, as a near miss. Financial pressure compounded this uncertainty. Hubbard and Sanders, though patient men, had invested real money in the harmonic telegraph project, and had watched with a kind of resigned tolerance as Bell's attention increasingly drifted toward the voice transmission idea instead. Bell was acutely aware that his continued courtship of Mabel Hubbard depended, at least in her father's mind, on some demonstration that his inventive pursuits could eventually produce real financial return, and this awareness added a personal, almost domestic urgency to work that might otherwise have remained purely a matter of scientific curiosity. Before we follow Bell into the triumphant, complicated years that came after that first successful call, it is worth pausing to see him simply as a person, not yet as a famous inventor, but as the particular human being his family, students, and friends actually knew. Physically, Bell was a striking presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a full, dark beard that turned gradually to a distinguished white over the following decades. His eyes were often described as dark and intensely alive, quick to light up with enthusiasm when a subject interested him. He had, by most accounts, a magnetic and warm personal manner, quick to laugh, generous with his attention, and possessed of an energy that friends and family sometimes found difficult to keep pace with, particularly once he became fully absorbed in a new idea. His habits, especially once his fortune was secured, tended toward the nocturnal. Bell was, throughout his adult life, a committed night owl, often working through the small hours of the morning and sleeping late into the day when his schedule allowed it, a rhythm that occasionally frustrated Mabel and their household staff, who had to adjust mealtimes and daily routines around his unusual hours. He was known to become so absorbed in a problem that he would forget to eat, forget appointments, and occasionally forget, to Mabel's gentle exasperation, important social obligations entirely. He smoked cigars, a habit common among gentlemen of his era, and he had a fondness for good, plain food, particularly the dishes of his Scottish childhood. He was an enthusiastic and skilled swimmer and enjoyed vigorous outdoor activity throughout his life, a habit that may have contributed to his generally robust health in adulthood, despite the fragility that had worried his parents in his youth. Bell's intellectual appetite ranged remarkably widely, and this breadth is one of the most distinctive things about him as a person. Long after the telephone made him wealthy and famous, he continued to pursue an enormous variety of scientific interests, often simultaneously. Experiments in aviation and flight, including work on tetrahedral kites and early airplane designs, hydrofoil boats, one of which, the HD-4, set a world water speed record in 1919 that stood for years, genetics and selective breeding, including a long-running project breeding sheep with multiple nipples in hopes of increasing lamb survival rates, metal detectors, one version of which he developed in a failed attempt to locate the bullet lodged in President James Garfield after an 1881 assassination attempt, and even early experiments in what might now be called wireless communication through a device called the photophone, which transmitted sound on a beam of light, and which Bell himself considered, at least for a time, his greatest invention. Prouder of it in some ways than of the telephone itself, he was a devoted family man, and his marriage to Mabel Hubbard, which finally took place on July 11th, 1877, proved to be a genuinely happy and enduring partnership. The couple had 4 children, though only 2, both daughters, survived infancy: Elsie May Bell and Marion Daisy Bell. 2 sons died in infancy, a grief the couple carried quietly through the rest of their lives together. Bell was, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a warm and playful father, delighting in his daughters and later in his grandchildren, and he and Mabel remained devoted to one another for the rest of their long marriage. Mabel herself deserves particular attention here, for she was far more than a passive figure in her husband's story. Despite her deafness, she was an intelligent, capable, and socially skilled woman who managed the practical and financial affairs of the household with a clear-eyed competence that Bell, absorbed as he often was in his experiments, badly needed and deeply appreciated. She read lips so skillfully that many people who met her socially never realized she could not hear them speak at all. She encouraged her husband's inventive pursuits even when they distracted from more immediately profitable work, and she's often credited by historians with providing much of the practical stability that allowed Bell's restless intellect the freedom to wander as widely as it did. Bell's summer estate, Bainbray, built on a point of land overlooking the Brador Lake in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, became, from the 1890s onward, both a beloved family retreat and a working laboratory. The name, chosen by Bell himself, means beautiful mountain in Scottish Gaelic, a quiet nod to the homeland he had left behind as a young man. It was here, surrounded by the dramatic landscape that reminded him so strongly of the Scottish Highlands, that Bell conducted many of his later experiments in aviation and marine engineering, and it was here, more than anywhere else, that those who knew him described him as most content, walking the grounds at odd hours, sketching new ideas on whatever paper was at hand, sailing on the lake, and enjoying long conversations with his family and the scientists and inventors he invited to work alongside him. Bell's working habits, once his household could afford to accommodate them, took on an almost ritualistic quality. He preferred to work in long, uninterrupted stretches, and he disliked being pulled away from a problem mid-thought, a trait that occasionally frustrated household staff trying to manage ordinary domestic scheduling around a man who might announce at 10 in the evening that he intended to work through until dawn on an idea that had just occurred to him. He often paced while thinking, a habit noted by several people who worked alongside him, and he was known to think out loud, narrating his reasoning to whoever happened to be present, whether or not they had any particular expertise in the subject at hand. Watson, in his later memoirs, recalled that Bell's habit of thinking aloud was, in its own way, useful to their collaboration, since it allowed Watson to follow the thread of Bell's reasoning even when Bell himself had not yet fully organised his thoughts into a clear plan. Bell also had a lifelong fondness for correspondence, and he maintained an enormous volume of letters throughout his adult life, to Mabel during their courtship, and later during his frequent travels, to fellow scientists across the world, to former students from his teaching days, and to his own children as they grew older. These letters, many of which survive in archives today, reveal a man capable of real warmth and self-deprecating humour, willing to admit uncertainty or failure in his experiments with a frankness that some of his more image-conscious contemporaries rarely displayed in writing. Physically, in his later decades, Bell cut an unmistakable figure. Tall, broad, his white beard by then almost patriarchal in its fullness, often photographed in tweed suits suited to the outdoor life he increasingly preferred at Bean Bray. He enjoyed sailing on the Brador Lake, and he took particular pleasure in showing visitors around his sprawling estate, walking them through the laboratory buildings, kite-flying fields, and boat sheds scattered across the property, narrating each ongoing experiment with the same undimmed enthusiasm he had once brought to his earliest telephone experiments decades before. He had, in short, the temperament of a true polymath, restless, curious, generous, occasionally exasperating to those who loved him, and never quite finished with any single idea before another had already begun to capture his attention. It is this quality, the endless, patient curiosity, that connects the boy who built a mechanical talking head in Edinburgh to the aging inventor still sketching new flying machines on the shores of a Canadian lake, decades and a world of fame later. Let us return now to that spring of 1876 and the months that followed, when Bell's private breakthrough became, gradually and then very suddenly, a public sensation. In the weeks after the first successful call to Watson, Bell continued to refine his device, working to make the transmission of voice clearer and more reliable. The real public introduction of the telephone came that summer at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, a vast international fair held to celebrate the 100th anniversary of American independence. Bell, exhausted from teaching and financially strained, nearly did not attend at all, and it was reportedly only at Mabel's insistence that he travelled to Philadelphia to demonstrate his invention, alongside the thousands of other exhibits competing for the fair's attention. The demonstration that followed has become one of the most retold moments in the history of technology. Bell's device, modest and unglamorous next to the massive steam engines and industrial displays that dominated the exposition, might easily have been overlooked entirely, had it not been for the presence of Dom Pedro II, the Emperor of Brazil, who was touring the exhibits and happened to recognize Bell from an earlier meeting in Boston related to Bell's work with the deaf. The Emperor insisted on seeing Bell's exhibit, and when he placed the receiver to his ear and heard Bell, some distance away, reciting a line from Hamlet, the Emperor reportedly exclaimed in astonishment, "My God, it talks!" Sir William Thomson, the eminent British physicist later known as Lord Kelvin, was also present and examined the device with great scientific interest, later calling it the most wonderful thing he had seen in America. This unexpected royal and scientific endorsement transformed Bell's telephone from an obscure curiosity into the sensation of the entire exposition. From that moment, the telephone's fame spread with genuine speed, though its commercial success took more patient work to secure. Bell spent much of the following year giving public lectures and demonstrations, transmitting sound over increasingly long distances to skeptical and delighted audiences, proving again and again that the human voice really could travel through a wire. On July 9th, 1877, Bell, Hubbard, Sanders and Thomas Watson formally established the Bell Telephone Company, with Bell himself holding a substantial ownership stake, though he took relatively little direct role in the company's business operations, preferring to leave matters of commerce to Hubbard and later company leadership while he pursued further invention. The telephone's early growth was rapid but not without serious challenge. Chief among these was a monumental legal battle with the Western Union Telegraph Company, which had initially dismissed the telephone as a mere curiosity, but soon recognized its enormous commercial potential and began backing its own telephone technology, developed in part using the work of Elisha Gray and the celebrated inventor Thomas Edison. The resulting legal conflict centered on the validity and priority of Bell's patent was one of the most significant and hard-fought patent disputes in American history, eventually reaching a settlement in 1879 in which Western Union withdrew from the telephone business entirely, acknowledging Bell's patent rights in exchange for a percentage of telephone rental revenues. This was only the beginning of Bell's patent troubles, however. Over the following years, the Bell Telephone Company and its successor organizations faced an extraordinary number of legal challenges, by some counts, several hundred separate lawsuits, from rival inventors and companies seeking to claim priority, or to invalidate Bell's original patent altogether. Bell himself was called to testify repeatedly, recounting in exhausting detail the exact sequence of his experiments, a process he found deeply tedious and which pulled him away, again and again, from the new scientific pursuits he much preferred. The most significant of these challenges ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court, which in 1888 upheld the validity of Bell's patent in a decisive ruling that settled, at least in a legal sense, the question of who had truly invented the telephone. It is worth pausing honestly on this point, as any fair account should. Bell's telephone patent remains to this day a subject of genuine historical debate. Some researchers have raised serious questions based on patent office records and the timing of Elisha Gray's caveat about whether Bell may have gained improper access to details of Gray's design before finalizing his own patent application. The historical record on this question is contested and, in the view of many careful historians, not fully resolved. What can be said with confidence is that Bell was, at minimum, the first to file a complete and successful patent application, the first to demonstrate a functioning device capable of transmitting intelligible speech, and the figure whose name became permanently and rightly associated with the invention in the eyes of the public and the law. The full truth of those closely timed February days in 1876 may never be entirely settled, and a fair account of Bell's life includes this uncertainty rather than smoothing it away. Whatever the precise legal and historical truth of its earliest moments, the telephone's practical impact on the world was immediate and staggering. Within just a few years of that first exchange with Watson, telephone exchanges were being built in cities across the United States and soon after around the world. What had begun as a curious experiment conducted by an exhausted young teacher in a rented Boston room had become, in remarkably short order, one of the most transformative technologies in human history, collapsing distances that had, for the whole of human experience up to that point, required days or weeks to cross by letter or telegraph into the immediacy of a single spoken sentence. Bell himself, however, grew somewhat weary of being known, for the rest of his very long and varied life, primarily as the inventor of the telephone. He once remarked with a note of genuine feeling that he considered the telephone something of a distraction from what he regarded as his true life's calling, his work with the deaf. The technical explanation for why the telephone worked and why it took so long to achieve is worth pausing over briefly, told simply, the way Bell himself might have explained it to a curious visitor. A telegraph worked by sending a simple electrical pulse along a wire, a signal that was either on or off, present or absent, much like a light switch being flicked. This was sufficient for the dots and dashes of Morse code, but a human voice does not behave in such simple, binary terms. A voice rises and falls continuously, blending pitch, volume, and tone into a constantly shifting wave. Bell's essential insight, sharpened by that accidental twanged reed in 1875, was that if an electrical current could be made to vary continuously, its strength rising and falling in exact proportion to the vibration of a diaphragm struck by sound waves, then that undulating current could, in principle, carry the full complexity of speech from one place to another, to be reconverted at the receiving end back into audible sound by a second diaphragm vibrating in sympathy with the fluctuating current. This was the conceptual leap that separated Bell's work from the many other telegraph inventors of his era, most of whom remained focused on sending multiple simple signals rather than one continuously complex one. Public reaction to the telephone, once it became widely known, moved through recognizable stages, the kind familiar to many transformative technologies before and since. At first, there was disbelief, a natural human skepticism toward the idea that a voice could travel invisibly through a thin copper wire. Newspaper accounts from the period often described audiences at public demonstrations as visibly startled, some flinching audibly when a voice emerged, apparently from nowhere, out of a small wooden receiver. Then came fascination, as demonstrations multiplied across cities in the United States, and before long in Britain and continental Europe, with Bell himself travelling extensively to give lectures and live demonstrations, often transmitting music, recitations and simple conversation over telephone lines strung, in the earliest cases, only a short distance, and later across increasingly ambitious lengths, culminating eventually in transcontinental demonstrations linking cities thousands of miles apart. Finally came adoption, as businesses and soon private households with the means to afford it began installing telephone lines, transforming the device from a scientific curiosity into an essential piece of everyday infrastructure within remarkably few years. It is one of the enduring and touching paradoxes of his story that the man who gave the world instantaneous voice communication considered that achievement, in his own private estimation, secondary to work that reached far fewer people, but that he believed mattered more. Beyond the courtroom, Bell faced a quieter, more personal form of opposition as well. Skepticism from members of the established scientific community who doubted, at least initially, that a young teacher of the deaf, without formal training in electrical engineering, could truly be responsible for so significant an advance. Some of this skepticism softened quickly once Bell demonstrated his device publicly and answered technical questions with evident and genuine command of the underlying science. but traces of it lingered for years in certain scientific and business circles, adding one more layer of quiet pressure to a young inventor already burdened by litigation and public demand. Bell responded to this skepticism the way he generally responded to doubt throughout his life, not with defensiveness, but with patient demonstration, inviting critics to examine his apparatus directly and test it for themselves, confident that the device itself would answer objections more persuasively than any argument he could offer in words. The years following the telephone's invention brought Bell both extraordinary wealth and a peculiar kind of confinement. The endless parade of patent lawsuits, while ultimately successful, consumed enormous amounts of his time, energy, and emotional patience. Bell found the adversarial, repetitive nature of courtroom testimony deeply unpleasant, a stark contrast to the joyful, exploratory spirit in which he preferred to conduct his scientific work. He once compared the litigation to being forced to relive, over and over, the details of a single narrow moment of his life at the expense of every other pursuit he found more interesting. There were also personal costs to fame that Bell had not fully anticipated. He became, almost overnight, a public figure, sought after for interviews, lectures, and endorsements, his private time increasingly claimed by admirers, journalists, and business associates eager to draw on his reputation. Bell, who had always been more comfortable in the quiet, absorbed focus of laboratory work than in the glare of public attention, found this new visibility something of a burden, even as he recognized, with characteristic good humour, the privileges it also afforded him. Financially, the telephone's success eventually made Bell a genuinely wealthy man, freeing him, for the first time in his adult life, from the anxious scramble for funding that had defined his early experimental years. But it is a testament to his character that this wealth did not settle him into comfortable retirement. Instead, it gave him the resources to pursue, with even greater energy, the sprawling range of scientific curiosities that had always defined his mind. He worked, in this period, with Charles Sumner Tainter on the photophone, a device that transmitted speech on a beam of light rather than through a wire, an idea decades ahead of the fiber-optic communication systems it anticipated, though impractical for widespread use given the technology available in the 1880s. Bell considered this invention, in some private moments, more scientifically remarkable than the telephone itself, precisely because it solved a harder and less obvious problem. During these same years, Bell continued to expand his scientific reading and correspondence far beyond the boundaries of telephony, developing genuine expertise in fields as varied as acoustics, electromagnetism, and even early theories of eugenics and heredity that were, at the time, considered legitimate areas of serious scientific inquiry, though many of these ideas have since been rightly discredited and abandoned by the scientific community as both scientifically unsound and ethically troubling. Bell's interest in heredity, expressed most concretely through his sheep breeding experiments at Bainbray, reflected the broader intellectual currents of his era rather than any unique personal agenda, though it remains, like his views on deaf education, a part of his intellectual biography that modern readers rightly examine with a more critical eye than his contemporaries generally applied. He also turned his restless attention toward medicine and public health in more direct ways. When President James Garfield was shot by an assassin in July 1881, Bell rushed to develop an induction balance device, a rudimentary metal detector intended to help doctors locate the bullet lodged inside the president's body without resorting to further invasive and dangerous surgical probing. Working urgently under enormous public pressure, Bell tested his device on Garfield but achieved inconsistent and ultimately unsuccessful results, partly because the metal bed frame Garfield lay upon, unaccounted for in the tests, interfered with the device's readings. Garfield died of his wounds and subsequent infection some weeks later. Bell was reportedly deeply affected by this failure, feeling it keenly despite the genuinely difficult and largely unprecedented circumstances under which he'd been asked to help. This period of Bell's life also saw the founding in 1880 of the Volta Laboratory, established using prize money Bell received from the French government's Volta Prize, awarded in recognition of his contributions to the study of electricity and sound. Bell used this laboratory, along with the substantial portion of his personal fortune, to fund continued research into sound recording and reproduction, work that led to significant improvements in the phonograph technology originally developed by Thomas Edison, and to the eventual founding of the Volta Bureau, an organization dedicated to the study of deafness and the education of deaf children, a cause that, as Bell himself often said, remained closest to his heart throughout his life. It was also during this era that Bell became a founding member and, from 1898 to 1903, the second president of the National Geographic Society, an organization his father-in-law Gardner Hubbard had helped establish. Bell took this role seriously, and it was under his leadership and encouragement that National Geographic magazine began to embrace the vivid photography and accessible, engaging writing style that would define the publication for generations to come, transforming it from a dry scientific journal into a publication capable of capturing the imagination of ordinary readers around the world. Throughout these years, Bell's relationship with Thomas Edison, his most famous inventive contemporary, remained one of professional respect mixed with occasional rivalry, particularly around overlapping interests in sound recording technology. The two men were often compared in the press, two towering inventive minds of the same American era, though their temperaments and working styles differed considerably. Edison famous for his vast industrial laboratories and relentless systematic trial and error approach, Bell more inclined toward intuitive leaps followed by patient refinement, often working with smaller teams of trusted collaborators. By the 1890s and into the early 20th century, Bell's scientific interests had shifted decisively toward flight. He became convinced, well before the Wright brothers' famous 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk, that human flight was not only possible but imminent, and he devoted considerable time and personal wealth to experiments with kites, gliders, and eventually powered aircraft. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association in 1907, bringing together a talented group of young engineers, including Glenn Curtiss, who would go on to become one of the most significant figures in early American aviation in his own right. The association's aircraft, the Silver Dart, made the first powered, controlled flight in Canada in February 1909, a genuine and often under-recognized achievement of Bell's later scientific career. The sheer scale of the litigation surrounding the telephone patent is worth dwelling on a moment longer, since it shaped so much of Bell's middle years. Historians estimate that the Bell Telephone Company and its successors were involved in several hundred separate legal cases over the years following the 1876 patent, ranging from minor regional disputes over unauthorized telephone equipment to major, sustained challenges from well-funded rivals seeking to claim priority over the invention itself. The most serious of these challenges came from the Pan Electric Telephone Company, whose case eventually drew in accusations of political corruption reaching into the United States Department of Justice itself, and from a lengthy and closely watched suit brought by the United States government in the 1880s, questioning whether Bell's patent had been properly and honestly obtained. Bell was required, across these years to testify repeatedly and in exhaustive detail about experiments conducted a decade or more earlier, reconstructing from memory and from surviving notebooks the precise sequence of his laboratory work in 1875 and 1876. He found this process, by his own account tedious in the extreme, a strange kind of punishment for having succeeded. Rather than being left to pursue new ideas, he was required, again and again, to relitigate the details of an old one. The 1888 Supreme Court decision that finally settled the core patent question in Bell's favour was, in a sense, the last word on a debate that had consumed more than a decade of his life. But it did not entirely erase the shadow of uncertainty that continued to surround the invention's precise origin story. Some later historians and researchers, examining surviving patent office records more than a century afterward, have suggested that Bell's own patent application may have benefited from details he could only have learned by seeing, even briefly, some record of Elisha Gray's competing caveat, which described a similar liquid transmitter design using a very particular and distinctive technical approach that appeared, some argue, rather suddenly in Bell's own subsequent notebook entries. Other historians dispute this reading, noting the ambiguity of the surviving evidence and the ordinary human tendency of independent inventors working on closely related problems using the scientific knowledge available to anyone in that era to arrive at similar solutions without any improper contact at all. This remains, honestly, one of the genuine unresolved questions of 19th century invention history, and it deserves acknowledgement here rather than a tidier resolution than the historical record actually supports. What is not disputed, however, is Bell's own personal discomfort with the entire adversarial process. He much preferred, by every account from those who knew him, the collaborative, exploratory spirit of laboratory work to the combative posturing of courtroom argument, and he expressed on multiple occasions a wish that he could simply hand the legal defence of his patent to others entirely, so that he might return his full attention to the kinds of scientific questions that had originally drawn him toward invention in the first place. In many respects, this is exactly what eventually happened. As the Bell Telephone Company grew into a large and increasingly professionally managed corporation, Bell's own direct involvement in its business and legal affairs diminished steadily, freeing him, particularly from the 1880s onward, to pursue the far wider range of scientific curiosities that occupied the remaining 4 decades of his life. Through all of this, the lawsuits, the public demands, the ever-expanding range of scientific pursuits, Bell remained, at his core, the same curious, restless boy who had once built a mechanical talking head in his father's Edinburgh workshop. Fame and wealth changed the scale of his ambitions, but they did not fundamentally change the shape of his mind. As Bell moved into his 60s and beyond, the frantic pace of his younger years gradually gave way to a gentler rhythm, though his curiosity never fully quieted. He and Mabel divided their time between Washington, D.C., where they maintained a home, and Bean Bray, their beloved estate in Nova Scotia, which increasingly became the true centre of Bell's later scientific work and family life. Bell's later years were marked by a certain contentment that had not always been available to him during the striving decades of his 30s and 40s. His financial security was well established. His reputation, whatever its complications regarding the telephone patent disputes, was secure as one of the great inventive minds of his era. His marriage to Mabel remained a source of genuine warmth and companionship, and his daughters had grown into accomplished women with families of their own, giving Bell the particular joy of grandchildren, whom by all accounts he adored, delighting in their visits to Bean Bray and in showing them the various half-finished mechanical projects scattered across his laboratory and workshop. He continued to work, almost until the very end of his life, on the hydrofoil boat experiments that had long fascinated him, collaborating closely with a young engineer named Casey Baldwin. Their most significant achievement together, the HD4 hydrofoil, set a world marine speed record in 1919, travelling faster than any boat had ever travelled before, a genuinely remarkable technical achievement that came near the very close of Bell's inventive career, more than 4 decades after his first telephone patent. Bell's health, robust for much of his adult life after the fragile years of his youth, began to decline gradually in his final years, complicated by the effects of diabetes, a condition for which the medical treatments available at the time, this being years before the discovery and widespread availability of insulin, offered only limited and imperfect relief. Those closest to him during this period described a man who remained mentally sharp and engaged with the world, even as his physical strength diminished, still sketching new ideas, still corresponding with scientists and engineers, still walking the grounds of Bainbridge when his strength allowed it. He maintained, throughout these later years, his devotion to the cause of deaf education, continuing his involvement with the Volta Bureau and remaining in contact with former students and colleagues from his earliest teaching days in Boston, decades earlier. It is a measure of how central this work remained to his sense of self that even as the world continued to celebrate him chiefly as the inventor of the telephone, Bell himself, in his private correspondence and conversations, often returned to his teaching work as the accomplishment he valued most deeply. As 1922 arrived, Bell was 75 years old, his once dark hair and beard now entirely white. His energy diminished, but his mind, by every account, still active and engaged. He and Mabel remained together at Bainbridge through that summer, the estate as beautiful as it had always been, the Brador Lake stretching out below the house, exactly as it had for the 3 decades since Bell first fell in love with the landscape's resemblance to his native Scottish Highlands. Bainbridge during these later years functioned as something close to a private research institute, staffed by a rotating group of young engineers, assistants, and family members, all drawn into Bell's still considerable orbit of curiosity. Visitors to the estate during this period described an atmosphere that mixed serious scientific purpose with an almost playful experimental spirit. Kites of Bell's own tetrahedral design rising over the fields, half-finished hydrofoil hulls resting in boat sheds along the shore, and Bell himself, white-bearded and often dressed for outdoor work rather than formal occasion, moving among these projects with an enthusiasm that visitors frequently remarked seemed entirely undiminished by age or accumulated fame. Family life at Bainbridge in these years carried its own particular warmth. Bell's daughters, Elsie and Daisy, now grown with children of their own, visited regularly, and Bell delighted in his grandchildren's company, often pulling them into his ongoing experiments as informal assistants, teaching them, the way his own father had once taught him, that scientific curiosity was simply another form of careful attention paid to the world. Mabel, for her part, continued to manage the practical affairs of the household and estate with the same quiet competence she'd shown throughout their marriage, and the couple were often observed, by visitors and family alike, communicating with a kind of easy, wordless understanding built across more than 4 decades together. Mabel reading his lips and expressions with practiced skill, Bell adjusting his own speech and gestures instinctively to make himself understood, the two of them still, after all those years, fluent in the particular private language 2 people build when one of them lives without the ordinary channel of sound. Bell also used these later years to reflect, in correspondence and occasional public remarks, on the arc of his own life. He spoke, on more than one occasion, of his conviction that scientific progress depended less on isolated flashes of genius than on patient, sustained attention paid to problems that most people considered either too difficult or too strange to be worth pursuing. He encouraged young scientists and inventors who sought his advice to follow their genuine curiosity rather than the safer, more conventional paths their training might suggest, advice that echoed, whether he fully recognized it or not, the very unconventional path that had carried him from a struggling teacher's evening hobby to one of the defining inventions of the modern age. It was here, in this place he loved so completely, surrounded by the family who loved him, that Alexander Graham Bell's long and extraordinarily varied life would finally come to its close. In the early days of August 1922, Bell's health, weakened for some time by complications related to his diabetes, took a serious turn for the worse. He had been growing progressively weaker over recent months, though he had continued as much as his strength allowed to remain engaged with his surroundings and his ongoing scientific interests. On the morning of August 2nd, 1922, at Bain-Bray, with Mabel at his side, Alexander Graham Bell died. He was 75 years old. According to the accounts left by those present, Mabel, understanding that her husband was failing and wishing to comfort him in his final moments, leaned close and told him, gently, not to leave her. Bell, though barely able to speak by this point, is said to have responded with quiet tenderness, simply by shaking his head, no, and then, according to some accounts, forming with his lips, though barely audible, the word no, before slipping away. Whatever the precise and unrecoverable truth of those final wordless moments, they carry a particular gentle poignancy for a man whose entire working life had been devoted to the transmission and understanding of the human voice, and who, in the very last exchange of his own life, communicated something essential to the woman he loved with barely more than a gesture and a breath. News of Bell's death spread quickly around the world, carried, with a certain fitting symbolism, by the very telephone network his invention had made possible. In a gesture that has become one of the most touching tributes in the history of American technology, at the moment of his funeral, on August 4th, 1922, every telephone operated by the Bell system across the entire United States and Canada fell silent for 1 minute, a nationwide moment of quiet in honor of the man whose invention had filled the preceding decades with the sound of countless millions of human voices, now stilled together in his memory. Bell's funeral was held at Bain-Bray, the estate he had loved so deeply, attended by family, close friends, and representatives of the many scientific and educational institutions he had been associated with throughout his long and varied career. He was buried on the grounds of Bain-Bray itself, on the mountaintop overlooking the lake, in a spot he had chosen himself, looking out over the landscape that had brought him such profound and lasting peace, the same view of water and hills that had first reminded him, decades earlier, of the Scottish Highlands his family had left behind when he was still a young man grieving his brothers and uncertain of his own future. Mabel Hubbard Bell survived her husband by only a few months, dying in January of the following year of pancreatic cancer, a disease she had apparently been quietly enduring even as she cared for her failing husband through his final summer at Bain-Bray. Those who knew the couple well were, by most accounts, not entirely surprised by how closely her death followed his. Their partnership had been so complete, so mutually devoted across 45 years of marriage, built from the very beginning on a foundation of patient communication, across the barrier of her deafness, that many who had known them together found it difficult to imagine one continuing very long without the other. She was buried beside him at Bain-Bray. the two of them resting together on the mountainside that had meant so much to them both, their graves marked simply, without the elaborate monuments that might have seemed more fitting to a man of Bell's worldwide fame, but that would have suited neither his nor Mabel's quiet, unpretentious character. In the days surrounding his death, tributes arrived from around the world, from scientific societies, government leaders, and ordinary citizens who had never met Bell personally, but whose lives had been touched, in ways large and small, by the invention that carried his name into households far beyond the reach of his own quiet estate. Newspapers across the United States, Canada, and Europe carried lengthy obituaries recounting his life's work, most focusing, understandably, on the telephone, though the more thorough accounts also noted his contributions to aviation, marine engineering, and the education of the deaf, a fuller picture of a man whose curiosity had never confined itself to a single accomplishment. The moment of nationwide telephone silence at his funeral remains, even a century later, one of the more quietly moving tributes in the history of American technology and public memory. For that single minute, millions of ordinary conversations across two countries simply paused, business calls interrupted, family chats set aside, operators at switchboards standing still amid the usual tangle of connecting wires, a vast, invisible, coordinated moment of stillness in honor of the man who had first proven that a voice could travel, whole and recognizable, from one place to another without ever being spoken aloud in the room where it was heard. Those who attended the funeral at Bainbridge later described it as a fittingly quiet, dignified affair, in keeping with the character of the man being honoured. No grand public spectacle, but a gathering of family, close friends, and long-time colleagues, held outdoors on the estate grounds Bell had loved so deeply, with the Brador Lake visible in the distance, calm beneath the August sky. It was, by every account, exactly the kind of unpretentious, deeply personal farewell that suited a man who, despite his worldwide fame, had always seemed most at home not in lecture halls or courtrooms, but in quiet laboratories and on quiet hillsides, chasing an idea that had not yet finished revealing itself to him. It is a peaceful image to hold at the end of a long and restlessly inventive life. A quiet mountain top above a still lake, two graves side by side, the sounds of the wind and the water, the only voices left to fill the silence that had once, for one remarkable man, been the central mystery of an entire lifetime's work. Consider, for a moment, how much of your own life has been touched, in ways you may never have paused to notice, by the invention Alexander Graham Bell coaxed into existence in that small Boston room. Every phone call to a distant relative, every voice message left for a friend, every emergency call placed in a moment of crisis, connecting a person in need to help that might otherwise have been hours or days away. The entire architecture of instantaneous voice communication that underlies so much of modern life, telephone networks, and eventually, through long chains of technological descent, mobile phones and the voice-calling features built into the devices so many of us carry every day, traces its lineage back to that single sentence spoken to Thomas Watson in 1876. The Bell Telephone Company that grew from Bell's original patent eventually became American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, one of the largest and most influential corporations in American history, its network eventually reaching into nearly every home and business across the country, fundamentally reshaping how Americans conducted business, maintained family relationships, and responded to emergencies for the better part of a century. The very structure of the modern telecommunications industry, still recognizable today despite the passage of a century and a half, rests on foundations Bell helped lay in those exhausting, uncertain years of experimentation in the 1870s. But Bell's legacy extends well beyond the telephone itself, reaching into fields that many people who recognize his name have never fully connected to him. His work at the Volta Laboratory contributed meaningfully to the development of sound recording technology, improving upon the early phonograph and helping to establish practices still recognizable in modern audio recording. His leadership of the National Geographic Society helped shape one of the most enduring and beloved publications in the history of popular science and exploration writing, introducing generations of readers to distant cultures and landscapes through vivid photography and engaging prose. His early aviation experiments, though overshadowed in popular memory by the Wright brothers, contributed genuine and lasting knowledge to the young science of powered flight, and the Aerial Experiment Association he founded helped train a generation of engineers who would go on to shape American aviation in the following decades. Perhaps most significantly, and most personally important to Bell himself, his lifelong dedication to the education of deaf children left a lasting mark on that field, even as many of his specific views on oral education versus sign language remain, quite rightly, subjects of continued debate and historical reassessment within the deaf community. The Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which grew out of his Volta Bureau, continues to operate today, and Bell's insistence on treating deafness as a subject worthy of rigorous scientific study, rather than simple pity or neglect, helped move the entire field toward greater seriousness and institutional support, even as later generations have justly revisited and, in many respects, corrected the specific methods he championed. Bell's name endures today in countless institutions and honors across the world. Universities, schools, museums, and scientific awards bear his name, and Bell Labs, though founded some years after his own most active period, carries forward the spirit of curious, rigorous, boundary-crossing research that Bell himself embodied, having produced across the 20th century an extraordinary concentration of Nobel Prize-winning scientific discoveries and technological breakthroughs, from the transistor to the laser to the foundational theories of information itself. Consider, too, the specific and often overlooked way Bell's early insights connect to technologies that would have seemed like pure fantasy in his own lifetime. The photophone, which transmitted sound along a beam of light, and which Bell considered privately one of his finest achievements, anticipated by roughly a century the fibre optic cables that now carry the overwhelming majority of the world's telephone calls, internet traffic, and television signals across oceans and continents, light itself now doing, at a scale Bell could scarcely have imagined, exactly what he once demonstrated it could do in a small experimental setup on a rooftop in Washington. When a video call connects two people on opposite sides of the world today, carried in part along undersea fibre optic cables, it is worth remembering that the conceptual seed of that light-carried signal was planted by Bell more than 140 years earlier. His involvement with the National Geographic Society likewise deserves a fuller measure of appreciation than it often receives in popular retellings of his life. Under Bell's leadership as its second president, the Society embraced a bold editorial philosophy that favoured vivid, accessible storytelling and striking photography over the dry academic tone that had characterized much of its earliest publishing. This shift, encouraged directly by Bell and carried forward enthusiastically by his son-in-law Gilbert Grosvenor, who Bell had personally recruited to edit the magazine, helped transform National Geographic into one of the most recognizable and beloved publications in the world, one that introduced generations of readers who might never travel more than a few hundred miles from home to distant cultures, landscapes, and discoveries, expanding in its own quiet way the same fundamental idea that had animated Bell's entire career. That distance need not be an obstacle to understanding, connection, or shared human experience. Even Bell's more troubled and contested legacy in the field of deaf education has shaped ongoing conversations that continue into the present day. The debate between advocates of oral education, which Bell championed, and advocates of American Sign Language and deaf culture more broadly, remains active and important within the deaf community today, and Bell's specific historical role in that debate is now examined with considerably more critical nuance than it once was. Modern scholars and disability advocates have rightly pointed out that Bell's advocacy sometimes contributed to policies that suppressed sign language in schools for deaf children for many decades, with consequences that many within the deaf community consider to have been genuinely harmful. A full and honest accounting of his life includes this complicated chapter, alongside his genuine personal warmth toward his individual deaf students, and his lifelong, sincerely felt devotion to his deaf mother and wife. Legacy, in cases like this, is rarely a single clean thread. It is more often a braid of genuine good intention, error-bound blind spots, real harm and real contribution, all woven together in ways that later generations must sort through with honesty rather than either uncritical celebration or flat dismissal. And in the smallest, most everyday sense, his legacy lives every single time a phone rings, every time a voice, familiar or unfamiliar, arrives across a wire or a wireless signal from somewhere far away, carrying comfort, urgency, love, or simple ordinary news, exactly the way it did for the very first time in that small room on Exeter Place, one quiet March afternoon in 1876, when a young man's accidental cry of distress became the first human sentence ever carried, whole and clear, across an electric wire. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, at the end of this story. The strange and rather beautiful truth that Alexander Graham Bell, a man whose name is now permanently attached to the instantaneous connection of voices across any distance, began his life in a household defined by a very different kind of distance, the distance between his mother's silence and the sounds of the world she could no longer fully hear. Perhaps this is the deepest paradox of his life, deeper even than the more commonly cited contrasts between his humble teaching salary and his eventual fortune, or between his modest formal education and his eventual honorary degrees from some of the world's great universities. Here was a boy who grew up learning patiently and carefully how to bridge a gap that seemed to most people simply unbridgeable, the gap between speech and a person who could not hear it, and who went on through years of quiet, exhausting and uncertain effort to build a technology that closed an entirely different gap, the one imposed not by deafness, but by simple distance. Bell himself, in his later years, often reflected that his work with the deaf and his devotion to his mother and to Mabel, both of whom lived for decades in that particular quiet, had shaped his understanding of sound and communication far more deeply than any formal scientific training ever could have. It is a gentle reminder that great inventions do not always spring from laboratories or universities alone. Sometimes they grow slowly, almost invisibly, out of a childhood spent close beside the people we love most, learning, without quite realizing it at the time, exactly what it costs to be unheard and exactly what it might mean, one day, to fix that. He showed us, across his long and varied life, something simple and worth remembering as we let this story settle, that curiosity, patiently followed across many decades and through many failures, does not need to announce itself as genius from the very beginning. It can look for years like an exhausted young teacher tinkering after hours in a rented room, uncertain whether any of it will amount to anything at all, And then, on one ordinary afternoon, quietly, without fanfare, it can change the way an entire world speaks to itself. Alexander Graham Bell rests now on a quiet mountainside above a still Canadian lake, beside the woman who loved him for 45 years, in the landscape that reminded him, until the very end, of the Scottish hills where his story first began. The wind moves across that hillside tonight, the way it has for over 100 years now, and the lake below lies calm and dark, holding nothing back, asking nothing more of the world than to be exactly as quiet and as peaceful as it is. Consider, too, how much of Bell's story is really a story about patience, a quality that can be easy to overlook amid the drama of a single famous sentence spoken into a wire. It took him the better part of a decade, working around the edges of a demanding teaching career, often exhausted, often uncertain, often discouraged by failed tests and skeptical investors, to arrive at that one afternoon in March of 1876. There was no single moment of blinding genius that explains his success, whatever the tidy legends might suggest. There was instead a long accumulation of small attempts, most of them failures, patiently recorded in notebooks, patiently repeated the following evening with some small adjustment, across years that must at the time have felt entirely without guarantee of ever amounting to anything at all. This is perhaps the quietest and most useful lesson to carry away from a life this full and this long, that meaningful things are so often built not from sudden brilliance, but from ordinary repeated evenings of careful attention, given to a problem that refuses, for a very long time, to resolve itself. Bell gave those evenings one after another for years, before the world had any reason to expect they would lead anywhere at all, and when, eventually they did, the result was not simply a clever mechanical device, but a fundamentally new way for human beings to remain close to one another across the vast and ordinary distances that had, for the whole of history before him, kept voices apart. Thank you for spending this time with the story of his life. If it brought you comfort, consider returning for another quiet evening like this one, another life patiently unfolded from its beginning to its gentle end. Until next time, sleep well, good night, good